When I turned 9, I made myself a birthday card out of printer paper, 3 Crayola markers, and glue that had nearly dried up at the nozzle. I slid it under my pillow that night with a quiet hope that maybe, somehow, someone would find it. They didn't. That card stayed there for weeks, folded and silent, like me. From the outside, our house in Meadowridge looked like the perfect picture. White siding, green shutters, and flower beds that changed with every season like clockwork, lilies in the spring, mums in the fall. My mother, Grace, was the suburban ideal. Always perfectly groomed, always ready with a smile at the PTA meetings, and somehow always on the verge of being featured in one of those local lifestyle magazines. My father, Mitchell, wore tailored suits even on Sundays, liked his coffee black and his girls in ribbons, and played tennis with the other neighborhood dads who drove imported cars and made 6 figures by 40. My sister, Haley, was the crown jewel. Tall, blonde, brilliant in the way that everyone around her seemed to validate by default. And me? I was Elise. The second daughter. The extra place setting. The silence after the applause. 3 years in a row, my birthday came and went without so much as a balloon or a cake. I remember the first time it happened, my 7th birthday. I had spent the week before quietly rehearsing how I'd thank them for the surprise party I imagined they were secretly planning. I cleaned my room without being asked, set the dinner table perfectly, even folded napkins into triangles the way Grandma taught me. That night, Haley got a math award from school, and we went out to celebrate her instead. I said nothing. I just clapped the loudest. The next year, it rained on March 5th. I sat by the window all day, watching drops slide down the glass like little countdowns, waiting for my parents to walk in with a cake or even just a card. They didn't. I found a leftover cupcake from Haley's party 3 months before, scraped off the frosting, and whispered happy birthday to myself in the kitchen pantry where no one could hear. By the 3rd year, I stopped expecting anything. I didn't even mention the date to anyone. And when I came home from school and saw Haley's new trophy for Junior Debate Champion of the County placed front and center on the mantel, I didn't flinch. I went to my room, pulled out that first handmade birthday card I had saved all this time, and quietly read it again. To Elise, you are special. I had written it in blue marker with tiny stars around my name, because I thought if I made it pretty enough, someone might believe it was true. But in our house, love was distributed like fine china, only when guests came over, and only to those who didn't drop things. Haley could have lit the curtains on fire and they would have called it experimental curiosity. When she broke Mom's favorite vase, they laughed and said, "She has so much energy, it's a good thing, right?" When I accidentally spilled juice on the new rug, my mother sighed like I had ruined her entire life. You need to be more careful, Elise. Why can't you be more like your sister? Why couldn't I be more like Haley? I asked myself that question so many times that it started shaping the way I breathed, the way I moved, the way I sat in silence hoping to be noticed. I became careful, thoughtful, and quietly obedient. I said please and thank you like clockwork. I tried to be good, not for praise, not for rewards, but because I thought if I was just good enough, maybe they'd finally see me. One day in 2nd grade, I drew a picture of our house. It wasn't just any picture, it had every detail, from the cracks in the driveway to the wind chime that only played one note. My art teacher, Ms. Langston, hung it up in the school hallway. During the parent-teacher conference, she gushed about it to my parents. She's very observant. Exceptionally detailed for her age. Elise has a real gift. My father chuckled and said, "That's sweet, but Haley's the creative one in the family. Elise is just tidy. Tidy. Like a bookshelf. Like a drawer. Like something you appreciate only when it's broken." I remember walking 3 steps behind them on the way out, watching my drawing flutter gently from the tackboard in the hallway, like it was waving goodbye. I didn't cry. I didn't even frown. I just went home and erased every sketch I had hidden under my bed. For weeks, I didn't draw at all. Then there was that day, I think I was 10, when I came downstairs and heard my mother on the phone. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words stuck to me like static electricity. "It's just easier to have one kid who does it all right," she said. She was laughing. That soft, wine-happy laugh she used when gossiping with her friends. I stood frozen at the landing, my hand gripping the banister. One kid who does it all right. Was I the one she meant? Or was I the one who didn't? That night, I looked in the mirror and tried to find the flaw. Was it my hair? My voice? The way I always seemed to speak just a second too late? At school, I kept getting A's. I didn't act out, didn't talk back, didn't make waves. I was the kind of girl teachers wrote quiet notes about in the margins of report cards. Elise is polite, bright, and responsible. A pleasure to have in class. But at home, I might as well have been wallpaper. The only people who ever made me feel seen were my grandparents. Grandma June and Grandpa Paul. They lived just 2 towns over and visited every other Sunday like clockwork. They brought pastries and hugs that smelled like cinnamon and fresh laundry. They asked me about my drawings, actually listened when I answered, and never once compared me to Haley. Grandpa once told me, "You have eyes like a storyteller, kiddo." That's something special. When they came around, my mother would smile tightly and try to steer the conversation back to Haley's latest cheerleading routine or her upcoming school play. But Grandma June would always make sure to slide her chair closer to me, hand me a cookie, and ask, "What's going on in your world, sweetheart?" They made me feel real. And when I was 12, and I overheard my father telling a friend at the neighborhood barbecue, "Elise is fine. She's one of those self-sufficient types. Doesn't need much," I knew then what they truly believed about me. Not that I wasn't enough. But that I didn't need anything. That I didn't need love. That I could be ignored, overlooked, and discarded because they believed I'd survive it. They were right. I did survive. But not in the way they thought. I began to understand the true mechanics of invisibility during freshman year, how silence, once accepted, hardens into something like armor, except colder and far more permanent. It wasn't just the absence of attention or affection anymore, it had become a deliberate omission, a practiced glance that skimmed past me like I was scenery and not a soul. And somewhere inside that invisible girl, something began to shift, not loudly, not rebelliously, but with the slow, fierce certainty of roots cracking through concrete. Haley had bloomed into everything my mother wanted to hang like a trophy over our mantel. She was beautiful in the sunlit, magazine kind of way, the type that made strangers smile and say, "Your daughter should model." She wore popularity like perfume and left behind a trail of admirers that followed her through locker-lined hallways and community events. And while she floated on a tide of praise, I dug quietly into my own world, a place where no one told me to smile more, or asked if I was just tired whenever I dared to wear my thoughts out loud. I started writing late at night, long after the household had settled into the shallow breaths of sleep. I'd crawl into my window seat with a spiral notebook and a borrowed flashlight, its beam barely strong enough to reach the corners of the page. I filled those pages with stories about girls who had no names but plenty of pain, stories about hunger and silence and daughters left behind in crowded living rooms. And though my characters lived in made-up places, they were carved out of something very real, me. One day, our English teacher, Ms. Lawson, a stern, sharply dressed woman with a scar down her jaw she never explained, announced the regional literary contest. First place would earn a scholarship to a prestigious summer program for young writers, hosted by a university I had only read about in second-hand magazines. The program was 3 weeks long, residential, and incredibly selective. Most students didn't even apply unless they had private tutors and parents with connections in publishing. I signed up without telling anyone. When the acceptance letter arrived, printed on thick, ivory paper and sealed with a gold emblem, I didn't run to my parents with the news. I walked upstairs to my room, shut the door quietly, and sat on the bed with the letter in my lap, reading the words over and over like a prayer whispered in the back of a cold cathedral. The week before the program began, there was a small orientation at the university. Parents were encouraged to attend. I placed the invitation on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cat, a tiny beacon among reminders for Haley's cheer practice and Dad's business dinners. No one mentioned it. No one asked. On the day of my departure, I stood in the driveway with my overnight bag, my manuscript folder, and a paperback novel tucked into my jacket pocket. My mother came out onto the porch, not to say goodbye, not to offer a hug, but to remind me that the lawn hadn't been mowed. "Don't forget to leave a note if you're not coming back Sunday night," she said, not even glancing at my suitcase. Haley came out a few minutes later, already dressed for her friend's birthday brunch, her car keys jangling like wind chimes. "You look like you're running away," she said with a smirk. "Maybe you should." Then she laughed and drove off, the scent of her expensive body spray lingering behind her like exhaust. I took the bus alone, arriving at the campus 2 hours early because I didn't want to risk being late. Other kids arrived in sleek SUVs with leather seats and parents who looked like they belonged on college brochures. I sat on a bench with my folder clutched to my chest and waited until it was time to check in. Not once did I feel small. In fact, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Those 3 weeks became a sanctuary made of syllables and metaphors. I woke up every morning surrounded by kids who spoke about characters the way other people talked about family pets, fondly, protectively, intimately. I submitted my short story for review on the second day. It was about a girl who wrote letters to a dead grandmother no one else remembered. My mentor, a poet who had published 4 collections and had an MFA from Columbia, pulled me aside after reading it. "This," he said, holding my printed pages, "is not just good for your age. It's just good." I didn't cry, not then, not even later, but that night I stayed up in the dorm stairwell, staring at the ceiling, and felt something unfamiliar bloom inside my chest. It wasn't pride. It was recognition. When I returned home, no one asked how it went. My suitcase stayed unpacked for 3 days because no one noticed it in the hallway. 2 weeks later, Haley got suspended. Caught cheating on a math final, her phone hidden beneath the desk and set to vibrate with the answers. The principal called our house, and the fallout was instant. Dad paced the living room like a general before a war. Mom cried, not out of shame or worry, but sheer disbelief that her perfect Haley had done something so common. I tried to slip quietly upstairs when the accusations started. But then Mom turned toward me with narrowed eyes and said something I will never forget. "You know, if you weren't always so distant, maybe she'd have someone to talk to. Someone to set a good example." That was how I learned that my silence, my survival mechanism, had become a weapon to be used against me. "She's always alone," my father added. "Maybe it's rubbing off." Haley sat on the couch with tears in her eyes and her hands folded like a repentant pageant queen. I wondered if she'd ever be blamed for anything without someone else absorbing the hit. In that moment, something inside me splintered again, not with pain, but with clarity. I realized that in our family, there would always be only one real daughter. The rest of us were just mirrors. Either we reflected her light or we absorbed her darkness. And then, as if the universe needed to underline the lesson, my grandmother died. She had been my lighthouse in a foggy sea, always consistent, always kind. She passed on a Thursday morning, quietly in her sleep, and the funeral was held that weekend at St. Andrew's, the little chapel with blue windows that caught the sun just right in the late afternoon. I wore a black dress that still had the tag on it because I'd never needed to dress for mourning before. I sat in the second row, behind the family pew, because Haley had arrived late and taken my seat beside Mom. I didn't cry during the eulogy. I didn't cry when they lowered her into the ground. I cried only once that day, when I went to the church restroom to fix my smudged mascara and overheard my mother talking to one of her old sorority sisters by the sinks. "It's sad, of course," she said, her voice low but not low enough. "But in a way, it's a relief. Now we can finally focus on our real daughter." I don't remember walking out. I don't remember if they saw me. I just remember the white tiles under my feet and the way the fluorescent lights made everything feel too sharp. I went home that night and packed up every story I had written. I slipped them into a shoebox and buried it in the back of my closet behind a stack of textbooks and an old lamp. Not because I was giving up, but because I knew now that some gifts weren't meant to be shared with people who only valued shine over substance. I kept writing, of course. I entered contests under a pseudonym. I won regional awards that were mailed to the school, not the house. I cashed small prize checks into my savings account, which I opened without my parents' names on it. Invisibility, I realized, had become my power. While they paraded Haley through charity galas and award ceremonies for things I knew she hadn't earned, I built a world of my own, quiet, yes, but indestructible. They never noticed. And I stopped expecting them to. The first time I stood on the steps of my university dorm, backpack heavy with secondhand books and the kind of anxious hope that tastes like metal in your mouth, I realized what freedom actually felt like, not in the celebratory sense, not like fireworks on the 4th of July or car windows down in spring, but the quiet kind, the one that hums just beneath your skin, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. I had earned a full scholarship, not through some parental networking dinner or a last name advantage, but through essays written in the rawest hours of the night, test scores carved out of sheer desperation, and recommendation letters from teachers who said things like, "She sees the world in sharp lines and soft light." I didn't cry when the letter arrived. I sat on the floor of my room that still smelled like peppermint oil from the diffuser they bought for Haley's allergies, and I stared at the acceptance like it was written in another language. Maybe it was. Maybe I had never learned to speak the language of being chosen. College, for all its noise and chaos and fluorescent-lit common rooms, became my cathedral. There was no longer a need to whisper or shrink. I met people who didn't look past me, people who sat in small cafe corners and asked questions without scanning the room for someone more important. My roommate, Jules, taught me how to cook rice without burning the bottom of the pot and how to defend myself with my eyes when words weren't enough. My literature professor, Dr. Nori, told me, after reading my first story, "This is not just a voice, Elise. This is a weapon. Use it wisely." And I did. I started therapy at the campus mental health center, scheduled quietly under a false name the first few times, just in case anyone asked. The woman I saw, a soft-spoken psychologist named Dr. Avery, never once asked why I flinched when she used the word mother. She waited. She let me arrive at the words myself, and when I did, when I said, "I don't think they ever saw me as someone worth loving," she didn't correct me. She didn't reach for some empty platitude about how parents do their best. She simply said, "And how has that shaped the way you love yourself?" I didn't know then. But I wanted to find out. By my junior year, I had published 3 short stories in small literary journals, each under my full name, Elise Wren Hollis, each one a quiet rebellion printed in black ink and read by strangers who didn't need to know about Haley's spelling bee trophies or my father's country club politics. I was building a life where my worth wasn't up for debate at the dinner table. And then, in my final semester, it happened. Haley started a podcast. At first, it was just another vanity project she launched between Instagram brand deals and part-time social media consulting for a boutique gym. But somewhere around episode 5, someone sent me the link. The title was "The Smart One, Living in the Shadow of Stereotypes." I didn't click immediately. I let the notification sit on my phone screen like a ticking bomb. And when I finally listened, tucked beneath my covers with the volume low, I felt each word peel something off my skin. She told my story. Not just abstract themes or echoes of shared childhood experiences, but my exact words, my metaphors, my struggle. She recited my pain as if she had lived it, used lines from my published essays and reframed them through her lens of faux trauma. "People think being the smart one is easy," she said in that polished voice she used for sponsorships. "But they never see the loneliness. The pressure. The feeling of not being heard at home." She was applauded for her vulnerability. The episode got picked up by a national podcast network. She was praised for breaking the mold. And me? I listened to my own story regurgitated like secondhand sorrow, and I felt the kind of anger that doesn't explode, it calcifies. I didn't confront her. Not then. I couldn't. There were still too many pieces of me that remembered the girl who begged for her mother's attention by winning spelling bees and drawing silent birthday cards. I wasn't ready. But I stopped following her. I blocked the podcast's page. I pulled my writing from the journals that still had active links and asked for it to be archived anonymously. And when the awards came, because they did, I accepted them with half a smile and a whole ocean of silence. That summer, I returned home for a single weekend, invited to my cousin's engagement party. The house looked the same from the outside, white siding, green shutters, perfect lawn. But when I stepped through the door, something had shifted. My room was gone. Where my desk used to be stood a rowing machine. My shelves, once filled with books and sketchpads, were now stocked with dumbbells, resistance bands, and protein powder. The walls had been painted gray. My childhood was erased in the color of cold steel. I opened the closet. Empty. My journals, the ones I had written in for over a decade, gone. When I asked my mother, her response was both casual and cruel. "We thought you wouldn't be coming back. You live in the city now, don't you?" I stood in the hallway, heart thrumming like a warning siren, as she sipped her green smoothie and turned back toward her iPad, already scrolling through table linens for Haley's bridal shower. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with my father and mother, Haley nowhere in sight because she had a facial appointment, they slid a white envelope across the table. Inside was a breakdown of wedding expenses, venue, flowers, catering, and a note at the bottom written in my father's handwriting: "Any help would be appreciated. Family supports family." I stared at the list, each line item more ridiculous than the last. $1,200 for floral arches. $6,500 for custom lighting ambience. A handwritten note from my mother added, "Since you're doing well now, we thought you'd want to contribute." I folded the paper once, twice, 3 times before placing it back into the envelope and pushing it across the table with one deliberate gesture. "I'm not paying for Haley's fantasy wedding," I said. "Especially when you've never once asked how I'm doing, or if I need anything." My father's jaw tightened. My mother sighed like I had just spilled red wine on her new carpet. "Well," she said with a finality that sounded rehearsed, "if that's how you feel, then I guess you're not really part of this family anymore." She didn't say it with anger. She said it like she was finally setting down a burden. And in that moment, for the first time in 23 years, I agreed with her. I wasn't part of their family. Not because I didn't love, but because I had stopped begging to be loved in return. The wedding invitation arrived in an envelope the color of powdered bone, embossed with gold foil and the scent of arrogance. It was addressed in Haley's handwriting, neat and expensive, as if the letters had been drawn by a calligraphy artist and not by the girl who once stole my pencils and blamed me for breaking the remote. The name on the front, Elise Hollis, stood alone, no guest included, no personal note tucked inside, just the time, date, and location printed with sterile precision. It wasn't an invitation extended with warmth or even obligation. It was a formality, a box ticked by someone who wanted plausible deniability when people asked if her sister was coming. I stared at the card for a full hour before placing it face down on the kitchen counter, next to an unpaid electric bill and a coffee ring I hadn't bothered to wipe. It wasn't the invitation that haunted me, it was the weight of what I knew I would do. I would go. Not for them. Not for the optics. But because I needed to see the final act of the play in which I had always been cast as background. The venue was a colonial estate rented for an obscene amount of money, the kind of place where everything was white and glass and trimmed in soft blush tones to mimic effortless elegance. I arrived in a black dress that fit like armor, my hair swept up not for style but for distance. The guests glittered around the edges of manicured hedges and champagne towers, and I moved through them like a shadow dressed in silk, untouched by the lights that only turned toward the stage. Haley was the centerpiece of it all, of course she was, with her fitted lace gown, hand-sewn in Paris, and a smile so wide it bordered on hunger. She wore the kind of happiness people mistake for wholeness. And when she saw me, her eyes passed over my face like one might skim a menu for something they already knew they didn't want. Glad you made it, she said, not a hint of sincerity in her voice, just performance. Before I could reply, she was swept away by photographers and bridesmaids who fluttered around her like obedient moths. I found my seat, a round table tucked near the back, closer to the kitchen than the dance floor, the place where vendors, distant cousins, and insignificant relatives were quietly placed to keep the spotlight sharp where it belonged. I didn't mind. The distance gave me room to observe. It was always easier to take notes from the outside. The ceremony unfolded like a Pinterest board gone viral, flawless in composition, hollow in depth. There were vows written with curated vulnerability, tears dabbed with monogrammed napkins, and laughter that echoed off rented marble like applause at a charity auction. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted as if they'd just witnessed history. I clapped once, slowly. At the reception, my name wasn't on the list for the bridal party table. No one apologized. No one offered an alternative. I found a seat on the outer edge, near the bar, beside a woman who turned out to be the groom's second cousin, twice removed. She was kind. She offered me gum and told me she liked my shoes. It was the most honest moment of the evening. I had written a speech. Not a vindictive one, not bitter. It was measured, personal, and brave. I spoke of shared childhoods and what it means to find joy in spite of absence. I wrote about growth, not hers, not mine, but the kind that stretches silently in places no one can see. I printed it on linen paper and folded it into my clutch like a secret I was finally ready to say aloud. But 10 minutes before the speeches began, one of the wedding coordinators approached me with an apologetic smile stretched too tightly across her face. "Haley asked me to give you this instead," she said, handing me a folded piece of cardstock with bullet points, simple phrases about love, gratitude, and how lucky we all are. The paper smelled like rosewater and erasure. I didn't argue. I didn't even open the speech again. I slid it back into my purse and smiled so that she wouldn't see the storm that had just broken inside my throat. When I stood at the mic, the room didn't hush because it wanted to hear me. It hushed because it was waiting to move past the part no one cared about. I read the generic speech exactly as instructed. I thanked the hosts, praised the decor, and said how wonderful it was to celebrate the love between two beautiful people. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't falter. But it also didn't belong to me. And then Haley stood up to speak. She was radiant, of course, draped in candlelight and pearls. Her words flowed with the ease of someone who knew every camera was pointed at her. She thanked her friends, her in-laws, her bridal party, and then she turned toward our parents, her voice syrup-sweet. "And to Mom and Dad," she said, pausing just enough for the room to still. "Thank you for raising an only child. I know it wasn't always easy." The laughter that followed was sharp and unanimous. Even our parents laughed. My mother covered her mouth with her manicured hand like the comment had caught her off guard, but her shoulders shook with glee. My father raised his glass, as if he'd been waiting years for the joke to be made aloud. No one looked in my direction. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just smiled, the kind of smile that hurts your teeth if you hold it long enough. The gift envelope was still in my clutch. It was not a check made out to Haley. It was a check my parents had given me months earlier, an inheritance advance, they had called it, as the legacy was something that could be itemized and signed away. They gave it to me with expectations unspoken but thick in the air, assuming I would use it to participate, to conform, to prove that I was still willing to buy a seat at the table. I never cashed it. Instead, I brought it to the wedding, folded into an envelope I had addressed in black ink. I waited until the speeches were over, until the dance floor flooded with choreographed perfection, until Haley was too busy posing for the drone camera to notice my absence. Then I stepped outside into the night, crossed the lawn to the guest cottage where my best friend's parents were staying, and knocked. They opened the door in slippers and mild surprise. They had driven 4 hours to attend the wedding only because I asked them to. When I placed the envelope into her hands, I also gave her a note I had written months earlier, sealed in soft paper and signed without fanfare. It read, You gave me more love in a weekend than they did in a lifetime. This is my thank you. This is my goodbye. They tried to speak. I shook my head gently. No words were needed. I walked back through the garden, lights strung like stars above rented beauty, back through a celebration that had never included me, back through the echo of a sister who had rewritten my story in her voice. I walked through the reception without stopping to say goodbye. And no one noticed I had left. Not a single head turned. Not a single hand reached. The music continued. The laughter swelled. The cameras flashed. And I, the girl once forgotten on her own birthday, became invisible by choice. The email came on a Monday morning, sandwiched between a book club invite and a reminder from the twins' preschool about picture day. It was short, formal, and unmistakably from my father, though it bore none of the usual greetings you'd expect from someone trying to reconnect after years of silence. There was no "how are you?" No "we've been thinking of you." Just a clinical plea masked as concern, dressed in polite desperation. Haley is struggling. The market collapsed on her latest venture, and she's facing serious financial consequences. She could lose everything. We're asking, no, trusting, you to help your sister in her time of need. This is family, Elise. Do the right thing. I read the email 3 times, not because the message changed, but because I needed to feel every syllable rot on my tongue before I answered. It had been 5 years since I walked out of her wedding and 5 years since I stopped answering unknown numbers or opening pastel-colored envelopes with my name misspelled. In that time, I had built a life no one expected me to survive long enough to create. I had become a woman who woke up to laughter, who made pancakes while dancing barefoot in the kitchen, who signed book deals and attended parent-teacher conferences with a partner who never made me beg to be seen. I didn't respond to the email, not directly. Instead, I forwarded it to my attorney, a woman named Meredith whose calm demeanor and steel spine had guided me through everything from estate planning to defamation claims. I added one sentence to the forwarded message: "Please handle this as you see fit." She replied within the hour. Understood. No further contact will be entertained without legal representation. I'll issue a formal cease and desist regarding further financial solicitations. Take care of yourself. I closed the laptop and returned to the sunlit kitchen where the smell of maple syrup mingled with the soft sound of Ella Fitzgerald playing on the Bluetooth speaker. My partner, Riley, was trying to wrangle the twins into their coats while they giggled and chased each other in circles. I watched them for a long moment, my heart folding gently over itself like the pages of a well-worn book. This was what it meant to belong. Not because I had earned it through perfection or obedience, not because I had waited long enough for someone to hand it to me. I belonged here because I had chosen it, because I had built it brick by bloody brick after walking away from a house that taught me love was a currency and I had always been bankrupt. That afternoon, after the kids were picked up and Riley was on a call with a client, I drove alone to the cemetery. It was a place I hadn't returned to in years, not because I didn't care, but because for a long time, even the good memories felt like they belonged to someone I no longer recognized. But now, years later, whole and scarred in equal measure, I returned with a hardcover copy of my debut book tucked under my arm. It had taken me 6 years to write. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly, but it was my story in every way that mattered. It was fiction only in the names. The emotions, the wounds, the long nights spent scraping words from the edge of an old pain, those were all mine. The dedication page was simple. For Grandma June and Grandpa Paul, who never asked me to be anything but exactly who I was. I knelt by their grave, brushed away the leaves, and placed the book gently at the base of the stone. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the nearby trees, and I imagined for just a moment that I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering, "You've always been enough." I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I had already cried all the tears they were owed. What I felt now wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. And peace. I stayed until the sun started to drop behind the treetops, then stood slowly, my knees aching in that way that reminds you life has passed but hasn't finished giving. I turned once more toward the stone and whispered, "You raised me better than they ever could." Back at home, the house was filled with the sound of dinner being made, chopping vegetables, clinking glasses, the bubbling joy of my children's laughter echoing down the hallway like music. I stepped into the chaos with ease, my coat still half on, and Riley smiled at me from across the room, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Everything's exactly where it needs to be." Later that night, once the dishes were stacked and the twins were asleep, we curled up on the couch with tea and mismatched blankets. The fire crackled low, and the room smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh laundry. Riley looked at me, eyes soft. "You never really talk about your childhood." "Not in detail." For a long moment, I said nothing. I stared into the fire, watched the embers pulse like tiny heartbeats, and thought of all the versions of myself I had buried to arrive here. Then I turned to her, my voice quiet but unwavering. "Because my story started when I stopped trying to be someone else's daughter, and became my own person. And that was the end of it. Not because the past didn't matter, but because the future was finally mine."